Atari Lynx was one of the most important handheld consoles of its time, but was also considered far too expensive and underwhelming in its range of released games to make it worth a bother. Which is exactly why I haven't bought one myself, so this episode is another emulation-based one. There are a few select games on the Lynx which I connect straight to a couple of specific periods of time in my life. Firstly, some games were featured on the games yearbooks I've mentioned a few times in this series, and secondly, it was one of the first machines I tried out through emulation in the latter half of the 90s. The closest thing that I have to a proper Lynx is the original model Evercade handheld console, for which 2 Lynx compilation cartridges have been released. But unfortunately, I have no way of recording HDMI signals, so I'm gonna have to do the Lynx recordings with the RetroArch emulator on my PC. Since there are less than 10 games for the Lynx that I enjoy on a semi-regular basis, much less have any actual nostalgia for, I decided to stuff them all into this one episode. All of these games were published by Atari, so I'm not even gonna mention that in the cover shots. But now let's get on to it. The Atari Lynx game that basically notified me of the console's existence in one of those games yearbooks that I mentioned earlier was Blue Lightning, a 3-dimensional fighter plane shoot-'em-up which was developed by Epyx as one of the launch titles for the Lynx, with Stephen Landrum of Pit Stop 2 fame programming the game. Immediately upon reading about this game, I got intrigued by this new handheld device, mostly because Epyx was one of my favorite game publishers on the C64, and realizing they had moved on to develop exclusive games for the Lynx was something of a shock. Blue Lightning itself wasn't much more than an Afterburner clone, but seeing graphics of this quality and in color on a handheld device was mind-blowing at the time. Naturally, Blue Lightning became the first game I ever tried out once the first adequately working Lynx emulator came to exist, just around the turn of the millennium. Experiencing the game through a PC screen was admittedly a bit underwhelming, but it did give me a sense of what I've been missing out on for a decade. As a launch title, Blue Lightning is probably one of the most recognizable Atari Lynx games, and deserves to be one of the Lynx games to be considered something of a classic. Next up, we have the Lynx equivalent of Pole Position, although I'm not sure if Checkered Flag actually wasn't designed as a sequel for Pole Position. Whatever the incentive was for Atari to produce such an unapologetically pole position-like racing game for the Lynx, it did become one of the platform's most successful games. The fact that it was often bundled in with Lynx itself probably had something to do with it, but it is a solid racing game with a couple of neat party tricks in it. Checkered Flag could be played in a multiplayer session with up to 6 players, provided that more than one Lynx owner happened in the same place at the same time, armed with a cable, or cables, to go into the COM Lynx port. But even in the undoubtedly more common single-player mode, you get 3 race modes, 18 different tracks, player-defined number of drones and your starting position, and you can even change the transmission and the color of your racing car. Also, the thing I prefer the most in Checkered Flag over Pole Position is that when you crash, you only get stopped for a couple of seconds and then you can move on. While in Pole Position, the game takes its time to have the explosion and slow screen drag back to the middle of the road, all of which take almost 5 seconds before you can take off again. Despite its fairly basic and old-schoolish style, Checkered Flag is definitely one of my favorite Lynx games, and I do come back to it more often than it probably deserves. Atari remade the game in 1994 for the Jaguar, using full 3D polygon graphics, and apparently the game was being worked on for the Game Boy Advance but didn't get finished for whatever reason. So, it's an Atari exclusive that deserves looking into. Another Epic's developed game that I read about long before I managed to play it is a side-scrolling shooter called The Gates of Zendocon. Some people have described it as an upgrade to Scramble, but I'm not so sure about that description. The way the Gates of Zendocon is built is that you go through a web of selectable levels, of which there are 51 in the game, and there are these gateways in each level for you to enter to get to another area. Some years ago I did play this game for almost 2 hours straight with no end in sight that I could tell. Most of the levels take less than 2 minutes to complete, and the only thing to make them lengthier are these creatures that act like the dots in Conway's Game of Life, which might take a while to deal with. What I like about the Gates of Zendocon is that it's a slow burner. It takes a couple of levels to gain some figurative speed, and it takes a few more levels to notice that there are actually weapon upgrades in the game. They appear seldom, and are difficult to notice the first time around because they're usually a part of either an enemy or the background in some sense. Between the gate jumps, you enter a room where you can attempt to land your spaceship onto a platform where you can fix the spaceship if necessary. And that's another thing, you can actually damage your spaceship in such ways as to make it less mobile, or even lose your primary laser cannon. If you think about the title of the game, The Gates of Zendocon, you might notice the word Zen there, which is exactly the state this game puts you into after a while. It's like the shoot-'em-up version of Tetris, in a way. I don't think I've ever played a horizontally scrolling space shoot-'em-up that I was more comfortable with, but saying that, I don't think Zendocon is necessarily one of the best one of its kind in existence. It's definitely worth a look though. Every first-generation handheld device seems to have its own puzzle game that's practically synonymous with a console. Some might argue that Clax would be the one for Lynx, but my money is on Chip's Challenge, because that's how often you see this game talked of in context with Atari Lynx, and not just compared to all the other platforms it was released on. Chip's Challenge is yet another Epic's title, this time the head programmer and designer being the legendary Chuck Somerville, who was largely responsible for almost the entire multi-event games sports series on the Apple II and Commodore 64. Upon first look, Chip's Challenge looks suspiciously like Sokoban, Boulder Dash and Saracen put together, and there are certainly elements of all three games here. You move Chip around in square-based mazes and rooms, and you need to collect keys and tools in order to get access to all the computer chips you need to collect from each level before you're given access to the exit. Come to think of it, the exact same idea was used in a Rainbow Arts game called Rock and Roll, which is a similar maze puzzle game with a rolling ball as the main character, and it was made the same year. Of course, controlling a ball is a very different thing to controlling Chip in a strictly tile-based maze. Even though Chip's Challenge is available on all the common 8-bit and 16-bit computers, Atari Lynx is the platform it was designed for. Oddly, it's also the only platform I've ever played it on, aside from a quick go at the PC version on friend's Windows 3.1 before I had my own PC. But Lynx is where Chip's Challenge definitely belongs. Now I'll be honest, this next game has nothing to do with nostalgia because I only found this game through one of the Lynx collection cartridges on the Evercade. But Todd's Adventures in Slime World was such great fun to play when I first attempted it that I got instantly hooked on it. And I'm not really even sure why. Well, I do have a hunch. I'm a fairly recent convert to the whole Metroidvania subgenre of platforming adventure games. Slime World is one such game, but a reasonably sized one. Todd's job is to explore Slime World and collect as many gems as he possibly can find, while blasting off an uncountable amount of enemies with his water pistol. You can also collect various items to give you weapon upgrades, shields, and other abilities. Although Slime World is a comparatively compact Metroidvania-like, it has 7 game variations which can alter the map size, disable your weapons, give you a time limit, or even disable checkpoints. The odd thing about Slime World is most game modes have infinite lives, so the only way not to finish the game is to turn the console off. Slime World can also be played as a multiplayer game through the Comlink's Link system, and it can hold up to 8 players in game at once, which was a record at the time, the only 8-player game in existence in 1990, and the only 8-player game for the Atari Lynx. The idea of a multiplayer Metroidvania game does intrigue me, but I know of only one person in my circle of friends who has a Lynx. Well, who had a Lynx actually, because he sold it a couple of months ago. Oh well, at least it's on the Evercade, so it's kinda halfway to the original. More Epic's goodness for this list comes in the form of Zarlor Mercenary. This was another one I read about back in the day, but for some reason this I haven't really played as much as it deserves, which is why I dug it up for this episode to remind myself that there's another good Epic's title on the Lynx. It's an automatically scrolling vertical sci-fi shoot-'em-up that gives you the choice to play as one of 7 selectable mercenaries. Your job is to destroy as much of enemy buildings and forces as you possibly can, and you will get paid some amount of Zarlor money for each destroyed thing. Between levels you can enter a ship upgrade shop into which you can spend all your hard-earned money. Too bad the upgrades disappear the second you get destroyed the next time, but you do have 3 lives to start with, and a fairly generous shield. What I didn't really appreciate about Zarlor Mercenary was its tendency to suddenly become a bullet hell type of a game, when the frame rate and screen size doesn't really support that sort of a thing. But I suppose it's all manageable with the correct ship upgrades and a bit of strategic positioning. Not necessarily one of Epic's finest moments, but it is a nice shooter that reeks of early 90s, in both good and bad, and deserves to be given a chance or two, particularly since it's a Lynx exclusive. One of my more recent Lynx favorites, largely thanks to the Evercade's Lynx cartridges, is a platformer called Scrapyard Dog. This one was also released on the Atari 7800 as well, but as I have no proper way of playing Atari 7800 games, this is the next best thing. Actually, the 7800 version is fairly different to the Lynx game, so I can't really compare the two. The game starts off with an animated sequence where your dog is taken by Mr. Big, an evil canine mastermind, and leaves you with a note to find them if you want to see your dog again. You are armed with old cans that you can throw at your enemies. Birds, rats, evil hench dogs and cats, some of which can shoot at you, or in the case of birds, drop bombs at you. You also need to watch out for holes in the ground and mechanical hazards. In addition to jumping and shooting, your character can also duck and search the background objects, which can lead you to find secret rooms and objects. What I found instantly charming about Scrapyard Dog was its graphics, and it has some weird sound effects too. The gameplay here isn't exactly the most comfortable, but you can get used to the somewhat fudgy controls. Thanks to the fudgy controls though, I have only ever gotten to the 4th level so far, but you know, it's still a work in progress. And as long as I'm even vaguely enjoying the game, it's all good, since the Lynx doesn't really have all that many games on it that I can call worth a bother. The eighth and final game for the only Atari Lynx episode I have any intention of making is yet another Lynx exclusive from Epix called Electrocop, which was one of the console's launch titles along with Blue Lightning, California Games and the Gates of Zendocon. It's a pseudo 3D action game viewed strictly from a certain perspective to have a forced sideways look to it, but follows you around in depth-wise movement as well as sideways. This decision certainly makes the game feel kind of unique, but for more bad reasons than good, mostly because it limits your field of vision quite severely. For the majority of time, Electrocop is basically a run-and-gun type of a game where you shoot various kinds of robots in very electronic-looking areas. To many gamers' displeasure, Electrocop has a timer of 1 hour within which you must finish your mission, which is to rescue the president's daughter. To make any real progress, you need to hack your way through doors using computers. The computers can also be used to disable robots and even play mini-games, which makes the game feel like it could have been intended as a spin-off for Impossible Mission. And there were rumors about that around, but nothing of the sort has ever been confirmed. While Electrocop didn't exactly succeed in getting this sort of gameplay to work properly, it was a brave attempt at doing something a bit different, and in the lack of an actual Lynx port of Impossible Mission, this sort of fills that space in a strange way. Obviously, it's one of those games that I like to try and play whenever I'm in the mood for some Lynx, otherwise it wouldn't have been included here, but I can't honestly say that I've ever really enjoyed playing it. So yes, it could have been better, but at least it's an interesting game, which is perhaps made even more interesting by the fact that for the most part of developing this game, the Lynx didn't even exist.